Right. Well, after that session, which was, I just wish we had twice as long, at least, if not longer, to get into the detail there. But really interesting. We've got another really interesting session, and this time we're looking at the impact of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement on UK trade and UK regions. This is obviously another really important issue, not least given the predictions of what would happen during the lengthy and tortuous debates over Brexit. But we're also in a situation where, because of all the other things going on, not least COVID, it's very hard to actually to figure out what is actually going on. So fortunately, we have a paper from Michael Gasiorek, Professor of Economics at Sussex and Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, together with Nicolo Tamberi, who is a research officer at the TPO and is also studying for a PhD in Sussex University. And after their paper, which they will present over the next, let's say, 17 minutes, Michael, can we do that?
We can
we'll have Okay, we'll have comments from Thomas Sampson, who is Associate Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. And as before, I'd encourage everybody to put their questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and then we can get straight into the discussion at that point. So, Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to kick off with the presentation, go through a bit of motivation introductory slides, then I'll hand over to Nico, as this is very much joint work with Nico. So if you turn to the first slide, Nico, as Creon has said, what we're trying to do in this paper is to think about what is the evidence as to the impact on UK trade with the EU since January 2021. We know that the TCA entered into force after a last-minute deal on Christmas Eve in 2020, entered into force in January 2021. We then use a series of different econometric techniques, which Nico will explain in a little bit more detail, but essentially we move from difference to difference to synthetic control methods. And what we find, to give you the bottom line, is that if you're looking at the first 6 months of this year, UK exports to the EU appear to have gone down by around 14%, 13.9%, and imports by 24%. What you'll see is what's interesting about those results is that on the export side, there was a massive fall in January, and since then there has been a rebound. On imports, there was a big fall in January, and there has not been the same sort of rebound. Okay, so next slide, please, Nico. Now, obviously, if we're thinking about the impact on UK trade with EU, non-EU countries and so on, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here, some form of comparison, we need to take into account that over the same time, we also have had the impact of COVID. And the chart there that you see on your screen gives you deaths per million across a whole range of countries over time since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And you can see that the distribution of the impacts has varied a lot over time. So we do need to control for that in some form or other as well, because clearly the various lockdowns will have impacted on trade as well. But that needs to be taken into account. There's lots of confounding effects going on here. Next slide, please. There's a little bit of related literature on this. There's a few papers, Graziano, Crowley, Dukes and Edwards, and so on impact of trade post-referendum, but not so much, they're not looking at trade post-January 2021, and they're very explicitly also thinking about the role of uncertainty in impacting on trade. We're not explicitly at this stage thinking about the issue of uncertainty. And then there's a little bit of work by Springfield from the CER on the aggregate impact on UK trade since January 2021. And the latest version of that work suggests that in aggregate, UK exports have gone down by about 13% since January. Next slide. What we give you here is the exports in black of the UK, in grey of a bunch of other countries, to, in aggregate, the EU, OECD and BRICS. What you see around January 2020 is the big fall in trade as a result of COVID and COVID lockdowns. And then for the UK, at the beginning of 2021, on the very right-hand side of the graph, a massive decline again in exports, followed by a recovery. But that recovery and the overall levels of trade appear to be less than the recovery of trade, the post-COVID, if you like, recovery of trade by other countries. And if you go to the next slide, you see a very, very similar picture with regard to imports. Next slide, Nico. What we now see here, take the left-hand graph, we're now comparing UK exports relative to the average of UK exports over the preceding 3 years. So we're normalizing by making it relative to the average levels of trade in preceding years. UK exports in blue to the EU, in orange to non-EU. Once again, if you look to the right-hand side of that left-hand side graph, you see a big collapse in UK exports, followed by a recovery. But again, if you look at overall levels, comparing from the left-hand side of the graph to the right-hand side of the graph, we see that while exports have recovered, they still appear to be lower than what we had sort of in previous years. Look at exactly the same sort of graph on the right-hand side, which is EU exports. Again, you see a collapse in trade as a result of COVID, a much smaller fall in trade around the time of the TCA, and generally a rise in EU exports over time to both the EU and to the non-EU. If you look at the next slide, it gives you exactly the same thing, but now with regard to imports. And here you see what I alluded to earlier in the left-hand graph, this differential impact on UK imports. So you, again, on the right-hand side of that graph, you've got this collapse in UK imports around January 2021, some recovery. But
Michael, I think when your head is down, we're losing the sound. I don't know if you yeah, and, that's great. Thank you.
And some recovery, but a much bigger increase in UK imports from non-EU countries relative to the imports from EU countries. And on that note, given that I've just raised my head appropriately, I'll hand over to Nico.
Okay, thank you, Michael. What I'm going to tell you is the different methodology we used and presents a bit of the results more in detail. So we focus on 3 econometric techniques. The first is difference in difference. All these techniques they're kind of putting together the data we just show in different ways. So the first approach is the difference, in which we compare UK to the EU trade before and after 2021, which is the TCA, with suitable control groups, which we thought would be composed of non-EU OECD countries and BRICS. Here we can essentially control for UK-specific effects of COVID-19 and lockdowns, but not really for other countries. What we do then, we add as control the number of COVID deaths that other countries had to try and take into account these issues. This is, if you want, the simplest method we use. We then move to a triple difference in which we incorporate now, if you want look at this graph, this kind of information. The difference in differences, a comparison of UK flows with 2 different set of partners before and after. And when we do the triple difference, we also incorporate this information here about other EU countries' imports and export to the EU and this control group, which is again OECD and BRICS. And in this framework, we can control for factors which are specific to each country in each particular period. So we can control for things. It is the evolution of COVID-19. You can measure deaths, yeah, but we can go beyond that and think about all sorts of unobservable shocks that affect the country in a particular period. So we think this is a much robust method for the estimation of the TCA impact. And finally, using the same set of data for the triple difference estimation, we use the synthetic control, which is in a sense, we say not all countries that we're using as a comparison might be a good counterfactual for UK-EU trade. So we're going to select only a small set of them, and we select those that can best resemble UK-EU trade prior to 2021. Just to look at the equation more in detail, that for the difference in difference, we have the value of either exports or imports from the UK to partner J at each period T. And we estimate this with a Poisson PML estimator, which allows us to focus on the effect on average trade, and which is directly translatable into a total effect on total UK trade. And then we have the dummies for partners and time, and then the interaction between a dummy for EU partners and 2021. We then estimate month-specific effect. In this equation, we can estimate an effect for the total of 2021 up to now, which is January to July, but we can also estimate month-specific effect. And in this case, we include partner by month dummies, so Germany, January, Germany, February, and so on, time fixed effects, and the interaction of the EU dummy with a dummy for each month of 2021. In the triple difference estimation, the equation looks similar, but we now have information on different reporters I and different partners. The reporters I would be the UK and the EU27 members, and J are the partners, which are the EU27 members and the OECD plus BRICS control group. Now we can include reporter by time dummies, partner by time dummies. So these are the two sets of control that allow us to take into account all the COVID and pandemic effects. And then the cross-sectional dummies for the pair reporter partner. And now we're going to look at the impact of the TCAs, of the dummy for 2021, UK as a reporter, EU as a partner. And similarly to the difference in difference, we estimate month-specific effect, now including these bilateral dummies for each month and a dummy for each month of 2021 interacted with the EU and UK dummies. Going to the results, what we find in the difference in difference is here we got exports over the period January to, sorry, that should be July, my bad, is a negative 0.6, which is just significant. And if we look at the effects by each month of 2021, we can find that this is really concentrated in January, and we find not much in the rest of the month. We've actually seen a recovery. On the other hand, for imports, we found a stronger effect overall over the entire period. And we see that these effects are pretty stable in all months of 2021. When we move to the triple difference results, we find very similar effects. Over the entire period, this minus 0.06, which is now not statistically significant. But again, the whole effect is concentrated in January for exports, while for the other month, it seems there's been something in March, but pretty much same story for imports, stronger effect overall, and we find that the effects have been very persistent across all months of 2021. We then move to trade disaggregated by some broad product categories, so HS sections, which give us about 21 product categories. And we run the triple difference estimator for each product category separately. What we find for exports is that results are very concentrated. The negative effects are concentrated really in a few products, mainly footwear and headgear, which saw a decline by 77% over the entire the full 7 months period of January to July 2021, followed by animal, and vegetable oils and fats at negative 63%, textile and clothing minus 60%, vegetable products by minus 43%, and then we have an effect on foodstuff and beverages and tobacco minus 21%, but this is mainly concentrated on the months of January and February, while for these other products here, we have a persistent effect across all months of 2021. On the other hand, for inputs, we find much smaller differences across product. The effects are very homogeneous across months and products. So there's a strong concentration in exports, but not very much on inputs. We then move to the synthetic control. Here we're back to total value of exports, and what we find is a result very similar to the triple difference. We find this very big. Here you can see in the blue line the UK exports to the EU, and in the orange line is our synthetic control, so our estimated counterfactual. And what we see is that there is this big gap in January, and the gap narrows very much in the following month. Once we do some permutation tests on the significance of these results in other months of 2021, we find essentially no significant results. Mainly, the effect is concentrated in January for UK exports to the EU. And when we look at UK imports from the EU, we find again the same results. There's this big gap of about 24%, which is very persistent in all months of 2021. It starts in January, but it remained constant in the other months of 2021.
Nico, I wonder if you could wrap up in a minute or so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to summarize, I'm going to be very brief on these. So we try to see whether trade barriers can explain any of the impacts across products, and what we see is we run our difference in triple difference regression by HS2 product groups using I'll focus on the MFN tariff for both the UK and EU tariffs. What we find is that for exports, we seem to find that the tariff can explain the change in exports across products, but not on imports, and that is perhaps not surprising given that we don't find much differences across products on the triple difference estimations. And I'm gonna skip on these. Just say quickly that when we try and do regional regressions for exports, we allocate trade using employment shares. We find pretty much no differences across regions. They're pretty much all affected in January and not much in the rest of the months. Okay, so conclusions. We find for exports a very sharp drop in January, but then a quick recovery. And then the overall drop is about 13.9% with a heterogeneous effect across products. For imports, effects persistent across all months, similar across products, and the overall drop is 24%.
Thank you very much, Nico and Michael, and a really interesting result there. I think a lot of questions on exactly what is going on and what underlies it. And for comments now, I'd like to move to Thomas Sampson from the LSE. Thomas, I'm not sure if you had slides to share as well. If so, please put them up at the moment.
Yeah, so I do. So Nicolo, can you stop sharing so that brilliant, thank you. Okay, where are my slides gone? Sorry, I'm just trying to find my slides. 1 second. Right. There we go. Okay. So great. Thanks very much, Michael and Nicolo, for a really interesting presentation. And let me start by saying off the bat, I think this is a really timely and important paper, which I hope gets a lot of attention and provokes a lot of discussion about what exactly is going on with UK trade. We have spent now kind of nearly 5 years since the referendum kind of debating what would happen when Brexit takes place, when there were new trade barriers. And we're now starting to get the kind of first evidence on how Brexit in the specific form of the TCA actually is affecting UK-EU trade. And this question of what would leaving the EU mean for trade has been at the heart of the entire political economy of the UK for the last 4 or 5 years. So the answer to this question is really important. Both, as an academic, I am interested in this question because it is a very unusual trade policy shock. We don't have comparable historical episodes where countries have cut themselves off from their biggest trading partner in this way. So this is a kind of novel natural experiment that we can hope to learn from. And obviously also from a policy perspective, thinking about the design of future UK trade policy, and in particular the UK's future relationship with the EU, understanding how the current agreement affects trade is crucial for thinking about what the optimal design of UK trade policy is going forward. So, great work on that front. I really like the paper, and perhaps most importantly, I believe the paper. I think the kind of key findings it comes up with are a fair summary of what the data is telling us so far. The empirical work in the paper is very careful. I like the fact that they have these kind of three. The key question is, can we separate what's going on with Brexit from COVID and from other supply and demand shocks? And they try to do that using these 3 different empirical methodologies, all of which kind of control for the different shocks in different ways. And importantly, the message that comes out of the paper is consistent across these different methodologies. And I think that reinforces the credibility of the results. I should also say I have doing my own research, kind of looking at this data and asking similar questions, and the findings that this paper is coming up with are at big picture very similar to what we're looking at. So that that also kind of gives me additional faith that two different sets of researchers are coming up with similar findings. What are those findings? What do I think are the main takeaways from the paper? On the export side, it's that so far we are not seeing a persistent effect of the TCA on EU exports. There was this big decline in January, but then there's been this really strong and I think surprising bounce back. So that from February onwards, it is hard to make the case that the TCA has reduced UK exports to the EU. Okay? At the same time, we are seeing a very large and persistent effect on UK imports from the EU. Right? And this finding is striking because I think if you went back to December and asked people, would we see in the short run bigger effects on exports or imports? Most people, I certainly would have given you the opposite answer, that we would expect to see exports hit harder, in particular because the UK hasn't yet imposed full customs checks on imports from the EU. So there is a bit of a puzzle here, right? And I'm going to come back to that later in the discussion. Why are we seeing the effects this way round? The other finding that I would highlight is, at the same time, it would be a mistake to think that the data is saying that nothing is happening on the export side, right? And here the sectoral results are really important, showing that some of the sectors where we would expect to see the biggest effects, things like agri-food, textiles, and clothing, we do indeed see falls in UK exports to the EU in those sectors. So it would be a mistake to interpret these results as suggesting that UK exports have just kind of carried on undisturbed. Something is going on with exports, right? But potentially, maybe there are offsetting forces that mean in aggregate we're not seeing effects. But clearly there is sectoral responses, and the anecdotal evidence that UK firms are being affected by these trade barriers. You can see that in some of the sector level data. Now I just wanted to show this graph, which is kind of Michael already showed earlier, which has exports to the EU on the left, UK and other countries exports to EU, OECD, and BRICS on the left, and imports on the right. The point I wanted to make here was that if you simply looked at this graph, it's not obvious that something very different is happening on the export side and on the import side. For both cases, you can see there has been a drop in UK trade relative to other countries' trade. And I wanted to put this up both to highlight kind of why doing careful econometrics matters, right? Because simply looking at the kind of summary statistics in this way isn't going to tell you the story that's in this paper, right? And I think that highlights why we do have to be careful in how we interpret the data and the value added that we can provide through careful quantitative analysis. But also, and again, coming back to the export side, even though we're not finding, or the paper isn't finding that UK exports to the EU have declined relative to exports in non-EU countries, you can clearly see in this graph that UK export growth has been very poor relative to other countries over this period, right? And I think this is something you also see in John Springford's work for CER. And a little bit of an outstanding question is whether that just that the UK has been hit harder by COVID and hasn't responded as strongly from COVID so far, or is Brexit having spillover effects affecting also UK exports to non-EU countries? And I think that's something that future work could look into in a bit more detail. A couple of further points I wanted to raise. One is about measurement issues and how much we have to worry about the fact that there were changes in methodology for data collection for UK exports in January, right? So the data collection method for exports switched in January from a survey-based method to customs declarations. Now, it's not ex-ante obvious that this imports a particular bias to the data, but I think it is something we have to worry about. Is could this methodological change be either understating or overstating growth in UK exports to the EU? It's not obvious how you tease out the answer to that question, but I would like to see kind of more attempt to do that in future work. I mean, we know that at the same time Eurostat made a methodological change, which has led to apparently large downward biases in the change in Eurostat data on imports from the UK, and and quite rightly in this paper they do not use the Eurostat data. But
Thomas, I wonder if I could ask you to come to a conclusion. I think some great comments, but just so we can get some Q&A, and that would be really good.
Absolutely. So point one, kind of let's think more about methodological issues and whether they might be important. And then this is my final slide. This research raises lots of interesting questions, and I think people are going to be writing papers about the trade effects of Brexit for the next 20 years. So here are some things I think that are worth exploring in future. Firstly, understanding why we're seeing this effect on the import side but not exports. Would we expect to see more evidence of a change in exports over time, particularly or additional import side effects when the customs border is introduced? And then as more granular data becomes available, I think there's scope for a lot of work trying to better understand the kind of disaggregated effects, which types of firms are affected, which types of workers are affected, and then bringing it all back. There was a big debate about the accuracy of ex-ante Brexit forecasts. This type of research is eventually going to help us understand how accurate those forecasts were. That's a few years down the road yet, but that's kind of where we're heading with this research agenda. But overall, great work, really interesting paper.
Thomas, thank you very much. And I want to give Michael and Nico a chance to come back on all your points, but I also want to try and get in some of the questions that we've got. So there are some that are sort of clarificatory and some which are more well, not more fundamental in a sense, but which are not about the data, if you like. So if I could just take two of the first of all, a question from Mike Stoyanov, which is actually one that I think Thomas has already flagged, which is, what do you think the reason for the worst recovery of imports, given the easements in the TCA, i.e. full border controls, not yet introduced in the UK? So that makes it doubly weird that we're getting this kind of question. And then there's also one from Matt Bohill, which is, what is the implication of missing EU imports? Is it lower UK output in some sectors, onshoring in other sectors, increased rest of the world imports? That's potentially something that may be going on. I wonder if I could also just add in my own question, which is whether there is something very specific going on in the UK around logistics, and whether that could be a factor. I mean, we've all seen in the news the coverage around lack of lorry drivers and so on, and whether that in some way could be having an asymmetric effect. But maybe we'll come back to the other questions shortly, but I wonder if I could go back to Michael and Nico on, firstly, any responses you want to make to Thomas, but also those three questions from the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Creon. Let me go first. And Thomas, thank you very much for your comments. Great comments, and I really liked your questions at the end, the unsolved bits. some of which Creon has now picked up on as well. So let me try and answer some of this, or at least give you my take on it. We don't know for sure what's happening to imports and why we've got this decline. I've got two hypotheses in mind. One which I don't think is likely to be the case, the other I think is more likely to be the case. Don't forget that at the same time, the UK introduced, January 2021, UK introduced its global tariff, and that reduced tariffs on a bunch of imports, MFN tariffs on a bunch of imports. It's possible there's some diversion going on here. They're importing more from China and the US in those products, and that's driving those import results. I don't actually believe that is going to be the explanation. I think the explanation, the one that I've heard from talking to businesses actually, and to the business community, the one that speaks to me most is that for many EU firms, the UK market is not that important a share of their sales. And the hassle of trying to work out the new paperwork, the new administrative arrangements, dealing with exporting to the UK is simply not worth it. And they therefore stopped exporting as much as they did to the UK. For UK firms, the EU is a much, much more important market. They need to work out what those administrative barriers and costs are. Therefore, we haven't had the same impact on export. That seems to me to be a plausible explanation. So it's to do with the behavior of firms in the EU vis-a-vis the behavior of firms in the UK. So I think that's plausible. The other point I wanted to quickly address is the issue of data, which Thomas is absolutely right to pick up on, because the data here is the way the data is collected has changed in January, both by the UK and the EU. We've got another detailed paper on this, which is actually on our website, where we explore this in a lot of detail. We think that the UK HMRC data is the better data to use, and that's what we're using by and large here, because although it changed from using the Intrastat survey, at least it's still based on country of dispatch. So UK exports are always based on country of dispatch. So we think there's much less likely that there's been that the change in trade is driven by change in the way the data is collected. Whereas if one was to use the Eurostat data, that's much more likely to be the case. Let me stop there and see if Nico wants to throw in any replies and comments.
Yeah, I mean, the data issue, as Michael said, we had another paper on that, which we thought HMRC data are much better than Eurostat to deal with this sort of questions. On the poor performance of UK exports in general, something we can think about is also whether there are effects of economies of scale. If exporting to the EU, if you reduce exports to the EU, then you get a higher average price, and maybe your exports are affected also to other countries as well. And that's something we might think about. And yes, I kind of agree with Michael on the interpretation on the import side. At this point, we don't have any formal assessment of it, but it might be that being a smaller country, in a sense, it's easy to substitute it, the UK as a destination for any EU countries. So that's on these two issues, really, what I wanted to say.
Let me sorry, can I just come back also, Creon, to your question about different supply chain impacts? It's something we started to look at by trying to look at changes in freight costs between the different markets. At the moment, even when we control for that, we have done some controls for that, we're not finding that that's changing our results. But you're right, that needs to be looked at, and we are looking into it.
Right. Well, again, unfortunately, I'm afraid we're out of time. I mean, there are a couple of data clarification questions in the chat, and I'm hoping maybe Michael and Nico, you could go back to the people who've posed those, unless they're very quick to answer. Probably it's best if you just go back by email to those who posed those questions. But what I'd like to do is thank you for a really great paper. Thanks to Thomas for some really good comments, and for the audience for their questions. And I'm sure this is going to run and run. And as you say, I suspect this is going to be a paper which is going to have a lot of comment and hopefully some press coverage. So there we are. And I think now it's for those who want to follow on, there's Wanda available, and I think the link is there available for that. And then otherwise, I think we have a 10-minute break. I think that's correct, before moving on to the next session. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much, Creon. So Nico and I are going to head over to Wanda now if anybody wants to discuss the paper in any more detail. See you there.